Um, that was, of course, totally gratuitous. It was the Jam. This is a Modern World, music from my youth. On Tuesday, I played you, of course, Radiohead, National Anthem. Now, does anyone need a copy of the syllabus? Anyone else? I'm not going to walk all the way back there, so can you pass it back? Hey. How are you doing? It looks like we are beginning to settle down in terms of the sections and enrollment. So everyone should be able to be in the section of their choice, I hope. And I'll check in with Karen, Katie next week to make sure that that's okay. If any of you are still having problems, let me know after the class. I put a new poll up on the BSpace site because I know you love that so much. And it's a question, I'm asking you basically whether you want CalPERG to come and do a presentation in class. I get asked every semester about this, and my policy is basically to ask you whether it's something that you want to hear. So I've put the email that they sent me online, and you can read it and then decide whether it's a presentation that you would like to hear. Any questions about the course organisation stuff before we get going? No? Great. I think I promised on Tuesday that this was going to be a much more relaxed lecture in terms of the amount that I talk. I actually have a scary amount of material to get through today, so I will try and be brief, but I really do promise that after these two lectures I will not be talking quite so much, and I'm hoping that you've all read your readings for today's class. I know some of you haven't quite got into that system on Tuesday. Okay, so today I'm going to basically give you a very, very brief overview of Britain in 1848. So I'm going to give you a compressed and very fast history of the enormous transformations that had happened in Britain in the century before 1848, just to give you a sense of how it is that you arrive in this place in 1848. Have any of you done 151B? Yeah? Yay. So you'll be able to basically come up and do this job if I start failing badly. And I'm going to divide the lecture up into two parts, and it's going to get structurally quite complicated because each part is going to have lots of subsections. But basically, there are two stories that I'm going to be telling you today. One is about how what I'm describing as the ancient regime of Britain, the old system of a society organized by accidents of birth through the aristocracy and the monarchy and an established church, becomes transformed by a whole series of economic, social, and political processes. Okay, so that's the first half of the lecture. In the second half of the lecture, what I'm going to do is talk to you about this thing called liberalism. Okay, and what I'm going to suggest to you is that this thing called liberalism comes out of a critique of the ancient regime and is there basically to try and make sense of the great transformations that are going on in society at large. Okay, so think of the lecture as simply having a first part that is saying, look, there's all of this stuff going on, all these processes are unfolding, and the second half giving you a sense of how it was that people came to understand those processes, through what set of ideas people came to understand those processes. by 1848, as I said to you on the very first meeting of the class, Britain is basically established or rather Britain has established a new model of what it meant to be liberal and modern in the world. Okay? And the key element of that, which, as I explained to you on our first meeting, that theorists subsequently have adopted and valorized, is this apparent miracle that Britain managed to combine rapid economic growth, profound social transformation, with the expansion of civil and political rights, but no revolution. Okay, so this is basically where we'll find ourselves in 1848, and it's that apparent miracle that is celebrated by Macaulay in his History of England in the year of 1848. It's that model of how you think of British history that became so influential. So I'm going to try and use this lecture to explain quite how that came about. So the first section of the lecture then, when I talk about these great transformations in British economy, society and politics, is broken down into three sections. Okay? I'm going to talk to you first of all about the new social conditions created in the late 18th and early 19th century. Then I'm going to describe to you the emergence of a new type of imperial polity, a new system of government across the British Empire. And then finally I'm going to talk to you about the great economic changes that occurred during that period. I'm going to emphasize straight away that historians have always thought of these processes as so dramatic or having consequences that are so important that for a century or more they were described as revolutions. An agricultural revolution, a financial revolution, a transport revolution, and an industrial revolution, etc., etc., etc. Okay, now I'm not going to be using those terms, okay, because as you're going to see, it's a much longer, more protracted process than a quick revolution. But I am going to be emphasizing that these processes had dramatic consequences, not just for Britons, but for much of the modern world even today. So let me begin by talking about this new society that emerges. And I'm going to do this in three parts. I'm going to talk to you about demography, the growth of the population. I'm going to talk to you about transport and communication infrastructures, and then I'm going to end up talking about associational life. Now, the big story here is a demographic one, I think. Britain is the first society to escape the Malthusian trap. Up to the 19th century, up to the late 18th century, when Malthus was writing his work, and we'll have more on Malthus in a minute, population patterns basically went like this. Okay? It was a cyclical process of rapid growth and then contraction. Okay? And that was, of course, the very pattern that Malthus, as we'll see, tried to explain. Okay? Rather sadly for the old man, at the precise point that he was establishing this brilliant theory, Britain's population managed to break through that cyclical process and go like this. Okay? And as you can see, the numbers here are really pretty dramatic. They're complicated by the fact that Britain was made out of these constituent parts of England and Wales and Scotland and Ireland. But basically, if you add it all up, you can see that the population grows from just 5.5 million in 1701, grows, doubles in size basically by 1801, well, more than doubles, but by the end of the 19th century had reached 41.5 million things. It's a dramatic scale of growth, and you can understand it, I think, get a sense of how dramatic that growth was when you see it graphed like this. Britain only had 5.7% of the land mass of continental Europe, but its population rose as a proportion from 7.6% in 1680 to 11.7%. So it's growing. The point is its population is growing much faster than than its rivals on the continent of Europe, from 7.6% in 1680 to 11.7% in 1860. Now, one of the consequences of this dramatic expansion of the population is that Britain suddenly became a really cool place to live in. Okay, the population became incredibly young. Okay, in 1851, 60% of the population was less than 24 years old. Basically like, being at Berkeley, for most of your life with everyone under 24. Very pleasant experience. Not only is the population very young, it's increasingly mobile and it's increasingly urban. And one of the big things I'm going to be suggesting to you today is what this means is that society has to be rethought. Okay? Its systems of government have to be changed. Its systems of trade and of economics have to be changed. And the very way in which people relate to each other socially has to be transformed. Okay? It's effectively a new society has to take shape with new systems of government, new forms of sociability, and new forms of trade and commerce. Let's dwell on the story of urbanization briefly. It's not that the British population had never been mobile. It's not that in the 17th century everyone was stuck in their village for all of their life. We know that actually in the 17th century there was a fair amount of mobility, even though there were these famous laws of settlement that restricted people to their parishes if they wanted to take poor relief. But actually a good deal of the population appear to have done a fair amount of travelling around on a seasonal basis, looking for work in the surrounding area. What we do know, though, that they were travelling by foot and therefore were not going huge distances. I think that both the scale of the mobility and the range over the distance over which people are travelling increases quite dramatically in the second half of the 18th and early 19th century. So in the census of 1851, the population census of 1851, 54% of the population were now living further than 2 kilometres from their birthplace, and the vast majority of people who had moved into the new cities had moved further than 25 miles. In other words, they didn't just come from the surrounding countryside. And once people arrive in the cities, it's not that they move into one place and they live there all of their life. They're moving around the city all the time. In the 1840s, 62% of families living in Westminster in London had lived in their home for less than a year. For less than a year. 62% of the families in Westminster had lived there for less than a year. And in Liverpool, 40% of the population were found to move basically every year. Okay, so a vast amount of mobility as people basically move from one landlord to another. The big story, though, is not just that mobility, but the scale of the cities that people are moving into and around in. So you can see that between 1700 and 1800, that there really isn't a huge growth of the urban population. Sure, the population gets bigger, so 20% of 15 million is a lot more people than 18% of 8 million. But the real change is in the 19th century, but at the end of which 80% of